what I want to do is move into this issue of the law, and I want to step back, and I do this every time on purpose. Can you all see that? Okay. Okay. Because what I'm trying to do is when people do like Old Testament ethics or things like this, it's usually done thematically. What does the Bible say about poverty or something? And that's fine. I mean, that's more than fine. But what happens is what people come away with is a collection of verses that they might be able to dip their hand into and pull one that they might want to be interested in. But I'm trying to do this very differently. I'm trying to walk you through the Old Testament, and that's why we began in Genesis 1, because I want you to get a sense of the narrative flow of the Old Testament. That it's actually, if you look at the storyline, it all makes sense. It makes sense why you have the ethics. It makes sense why you have the call to mission, which is, deeply ethical. And it will flow, and it will make sense to you. And I think that's where we'll get even a better sense of the heart of God, because it won't be just a collection of verses. It's actually how we understand the history of life on this planet, and the role of the people of God and the heart of God, and how each part of the Old Testament can contribute something different, you see. Because you have, right now we've been in narrative, we're going to move into the law, and the law will give us one set of contributions to our ethical framework. I think maybe next time, see how things go tonight, we'll move into some of the history and how the Old Testament looks at politics and how that plays itself into all of this. And maybe we'll do that for a couple of Mondays or so. And then we'll move into another set of literature where you're looking at Job and Ecclesiastes and Psalms, and in all of them are contributing a different kind of look, a different kind of lens into the human dilemma. So we began with the image of God, the idea that humans are uniquely made and are of unique value, that they are the culmination of the creation of God. But we also were talking about how humans are made to rule the earth. And so now you're talking about all this human potential. So when we work with people who have been marginalized, it's not just restoring their value, but actually moving them on to productivity and to contributions. And this is what they were made to be, you see, to continue the work of God on the earth. And so we are equipping them to grow into the humanity that they were meant to be. And the fall, we talked about the fall. And this is grounded in this temptation to be like God. And once humans start acting like God, they're cruel and violent. And the whole earth has been full of violence since the beginning. And this is the reality into which we live. And we talked about how in Genesis 2, it says that on the day we eat of the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, that we will surely die. And so if you look at the narrative, you see the dying are killing each other. It's separation from God. It's dying from old age and disease. It's God taking the life of people. And so death has been unleashed into human existence in ways that we can't imagine. In every kind of sense, we die. We die spiritually, we die physically, and we're dead morally. And so what we learn is that death has been unleashed, and we live in a world of death and darkness. And so this now becomes the quest to understand, if this will work for me, how God will move to remedy this. And so this is where we talked through Genesis 4 through 12 and culminate in the promise to Abram, in the idea of being a blessing, a channel of blessing to all the nations of the world, the nations that reject him, basically. And we talked about how this lines up with the Tower of Babel and all those kind of textual details. But we looked at how we are called to be a blessing. I mean, the reason for our, what we would say in New Testament terms, our salvation is for the world. We're not here for ourselves. We're here to be a blessing. And in the Old Testament, we looked at Genesis. Blessing is understood as both material blessing, it's flocks, it's food, it's water, it's children, but it's also grounded in the proclamation of the name of the Lord. And so this combination in our mission of not only being tangible in what we do, but also proclaiming it in the name of our God. And then we see how this plays itself out in the rest of Genesis, and it's an up and down story where they're faithful and they're faithless, and they testify, and it's a very complicated history, which is the history of the people of God. And so we have those mountaintop moments where, especially in Genesis 22, where he believes even as he's about to sacrifice his son, and this becomes a testimony of deep faith. And because of that, it says in Genesis 22, I will bless you because you obeyed me. So that was kind of the framework. It helps us understand why we're here and what we're supposed to be doing. And then we moved into the law. We just turned the page and now we're in Exodus. And that, what I wanted to talk about when we did our first thing on law was that look at where the law happens. And this is why it's so important to remember the narrative context. Now, I'll give you some passages there. And really, I should have also added Exodus 1, because what you have is Israel is in Egypt. They are under law. They're in a culture that is structured and functioning with its laws. And the society is organized this way, and the laws perpetuate and sustain. And because these are religious communities, they sanctify that law and that legal and societal system. And this is why the whole concept of systemic sin makes perfect sense in the Old Testament. So you have this idea that they're in a context of law. And what we will find is that God will take them from this context, put them into a desert in the middle of nowhere, and give them another law. Now, as we've said, we've got to think about the law in a different kind of way. When I came to faith in college, the whole discussion of the law was all about sacrifice for sin and how Jesus is the sacrifice for sin, and so we don't need the law anymore. We're not under law anymore. We're now under grace. I mean, that would be the kind of, and there's a certain truth to that in a certain take of the law that you see in Paul. But that's not what you're seeing in the narratives. What you have is the law actually is creating a new society that is different from the one they came out of. And so that is why, as I mentioned last time, it talks about inheritance, it talks about robbery, it talks about murder, it talks about land, it talks about marriage, it talks about children, it talks about what you do with your animals, it talks about what you eat, all these different things that are creating actually a culture. And some of those things are cultural markers, like food. Food is an incredible cultural marker. You know people by what they eat. And what he's doing is he's setting up dietary boundaries as a way of distinguishing them from the different cultures around them, and other things that will also distinguish them from the people around them. Now, it's a deeply religious society, and so that law is permeated with religious things, like sacrifices and other feasts. But even the feasts, as we will see a little bit later, are designed to help inculcate that legal world into their hearts and minds. And this is where you see this in the Anglican Church. It also sets up, through these series of feasts, a rhythm of life, a rhythm for what we would say the calendar year. So that's in the legal system as well. You see, so it's creating a rhythm of life, it's creating a culture, it's creating a mindset and a set of values through the laws. So the Exodus 2 piece is important because what triggers the Exodus in chapter 2 not only is the idea that God remembered his covenant, but they are crying out. And so part of the heart of the law is triggered by the heart of God to the vulnerable. And this is why the vulnerable play such a central role in the law itself. Now, this is very different than most people think of the law, you see. In fact, oftentimes people are trying to fight for laws to help the vulnerable. Where in the Old Testament, the vulnerable sit at the very center, or at least as one of the centers, of the law itself. And so we'll talk about this in just a little bit. And this will take you to chapter 19. Before he even begins to give them the law, he says that there will be a kingdom of priests. And they are a chosen people, you see. They are redeemed. And what you have after the redemption is the giving of the law. So the law was never designed somehow to gain redemption from God. They receive the law after they are redeemed. Now that's important because what the law is showing them how to do is how to live as a redeemed people. And that's why it'll cover all the areas of their life. Because the redemption that we have should permeate who we are and how we live and how we organize ourselves, not only individually, but also corporately and as families. So, and it'll actually move into the areas of politics, which we will talk, not tonight, but in other times. So what we're seeing then, again, is the logic of the law and the logic of its giving and the purpose of its being given. And the last piece before I move on is that Deuteronomy 4 passage, which takes you back to the mission piece, because that passage will say that the nations around them will see them and say, oh, what a wise God you have who's given you such wonderful laws. So the idea is even that legal system, again, people don't think about this in terms of the law, the legal system and the society it was to create, the society itself was to be a testimony to the nations. Now, you can see how this can bleed into Christian stuff, correct? The quality of our community, so to speak, is a testimony to the world. I mean, it's the same concept, but you're seeing it on a national level in the giving of the law. I'm trying to do this computer thing, so hold on. Okay. So there's something called the quadrilateral of the vulnerable, and I would assume that a lot of you justice people have seen this. Christine, have you seen this? You probably have. Herb, yeah. And it's very interesting. Again, because there's so many verses that deal with this and passages. And it's the very heart of the law. So, the poor, the widows and the orphans, and the foreigner. These are the four. And what you find in the law is laws working with these groups of four people, the four kinds of people. And what oftentimes we miss is the cultural context into which the law has been given. So what do I mean by that? Well, and this actually can help us with ethics today. If you compare what the Old Testament says about these kinds of people and other things like murder and theft and things, well, because these are human issues, and not unique to Israel or to any country in the world, in the history of the world, what you find is that the other law codes of the societies around them also have laws about these kinds of things. And interestingly, some of them can be similar to what you find in ancient Israel. Now, that's not surprising. You can go to any country in the world today, and at least in the law books, they'll have things about poor people. They will. Every country does. Whether it's some form of Social Security or some kind of safety net. Every country has this. Now, if they follow those up, well, that's another question. If they do this well, are these good laws? Those are other questions. But conceptually, human societies will do this. So that's the same in the ancient world. So you'll have these different countries and societies with their laws for the poor. You'll also find them concerned about widows. You won't find them really concerned about foreigners. That's going to be unique to Israel. They don't really, they mention foreigners in the sense of there's like merchants that'll come in. Sometimes there'll be a law about a runaway slave or something like this. But the breadth of concern for the foreigner is unique in all of the ancient world. So that part's more unique than the other things. But the other things are there. And what makes Israel different in its laws, even though there's some overlap, is that even though they're dealing with the same things, Israel's laws are more humane than what they have around them. And the other thing, which is crucial, I think, for Christians, is that the reason why they have these laws is unique. It would be like today, if you're talking to a Buddhist, let's just say, or even an atheist, you say, why do you care for the poor? They could give you some kind of rationale. As Christians, we would have a different rationale. See, so you'll have these different ethical systems dealing with common issues. They won't deal with them in the same way or with the same concern or depth, and the rationale behind them will be different. The same in the ancient world. What was unique ultimately about Israel's law was its God. Now, the other thing that we don't tend to think about, we kind of helicopter into these laws and are looking for kind of really nice one-liners that we can quote in a sermon or something, is that Israel was primarily, maybe up to 95%, a peasant culture. So issues of land and inheritance are fundamental for survival. What's also fundamental, you'll see verses about this even in Proverbs, about moving boundary stones. Well, this is very important. If everyone has their little plot of land that you're working as a family, those boundaries end up being very important. What you also have that helps explain to us the poor is that because if you've ever been in Israel, it's not what you would call a lot of rainfall. And so what you have are bad cycles, agricultural cycles. So you have this recurring issue you find in the Old Testament about famine. That's a real thing. And if people have members that get sick or members that die, they may move into poverty, even as you would see it in the work that everybody does. Sometimes it's just a whole series of bad things happening to a family that will kind of push them into the poverty. Well, this would be true in the ancient world as well. Different things, like I said, it would be lack of rainfall, a bad crop, somebody gets sick, and of course they don't have modern medicine. We think that by age 5, half the children had died. People's lifespans were a lot shorter. Women, because they would begin having children early, might last into their 30s. Living longer was more the exception than the rule. And you need children because it's a farming, and a lot of it's done by hand. And if half the children are going to die by age 5 from malnutrition or disease, you need a lot of children. I mean, so it's a very different world where all these things are very front and center. The other thing, again, I'm trying to give you a sense of why they have these laws, okay? Instead of just giving you a list of verses. For us, a war is an exception. And for the United States, it's always somewhere else. It's, in Europe, or it's in Africa, or it's in Asia, Southeast Asia or something. We haven't had a war on our soil since the Civil War. And at that time, we lost 600,000 people in that gruesome war. Well, for them, war was a fact of life. Even if you go to the 2 Samuel 11, which is talking about David's sin with Bathsheba, the first line says, in the springtime when kings go to war. Okay, just listen to what it's saying. War is a recurring reality to them. Why do the armies march in springtime? Well, because it's harvest, and this is how you feed your troops. And so as the armies would walk and march through your land, they would be taking your crops and eating off the land. So there would be starvation after an army had gone through. And because you would not have as big a professional army as we have in this country, let's say, a lot of the army, when there was a war, would be made up of what we would call militia. They would call, into the fighting forces would be the men, the farmers. And so this is one of the reasons why you have a lot of widows and orphans. It's not widows and orphans because people died from disease, which was there, but you have widows and orphans because of war. And so there's the men, and because if you're doing all the plowing and harvesting by hand, you need men, you see. So all these things are playing into the scene into which the law will move. So what I want to do is go through a few passages with the time that we have left. And again, I could, and I'm happy to do this if Christine wants me to, is just make a list of all these different verses for different kinds of things. But what might be helpful is to get a sense of what the law is doing. So let me mention some of these. I'll go Exodus and then some in Deuteronomy. With Exodus 20, you have the Ten Commandments. But the Ten Commandments begin with basically declaring that God is unique. And it begins, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So the God who is giving them the law is a God of mercy and ethics. And he declares this from the very beginning. And that's why they cannot and shall not make idols of any other gods, because the person of God is fundamental to the law, because different gods will create different laws. Okay, they saw this in Egypt. So getting God right means you get the law right, which means you get your ethics right. So the law begins, the Ten Commandments begin with focusing on the person of God. And then when you move into the law, it'll talk about ethical things. Even the Sabbath law, it's talking about letting, the man slaves and the female slaves and the foreigners in your midst at your gate rest, because these in the ancient world will be the ones, even today, that get abused. And so even the Sabbath law is an ethical law. It talks about killing, it talks about theft, and even it talks about greed, right? Lusting after another person's possessions and the wife of another man. And so what you're seeing, which generates, all kinds of crimes that we see today. But so what you're seeing is even the Ten Commandments are very ethically grounded, and ultimately it's grounded in the person of God himself. As I've said, if you don't do ethics and if you're not committed to ethics, you don't know God. I mean, this is what the Old Testament is saying over and over and over again in every way possible. Exodus 22 is very interesting, and I'll read it because I don't know if people have their Bibles, but I want you to listen to what it says. Don't mistreat a foreigner or oppress him, for you were aliens or you were foreigners in Egypt. Mm-hmm. Don't take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused and I will kill you. Oh, let's see, with the sword, your wives will become widows and your children fatherless. But what I want to highlight here is the idea of the foreigner, because you had been foreigners, but the idea of crying out. This is an echo of Exodus chapter 2, where the Israelites are crying out to God. And so what you find is vulnerable people crying out to God, widows and orphans and foreigners crying out to God, and God will respond, you see, and he will respond in judgment to those who abuse them. So I think it's important to keep understanding that God is emotionally committed to this. So it's not just some kind of abstract law or objective law. I mean, there's part of that there, right? But that he's actually responding emotionally to the cry of the vulnerable. And I think that's important for us to embrace and to find encouragement from. Exodus 23, 1-3, do not spread false reports. Do not help a wicked man by being a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor man in his lawsuit. Now, Herb was asking about systemic sin. This is law courts here. See, and they're concerned about law and how law is dealt with in the courts. Now, back then, it's not like what we have today. Back then, mostly, you would have at the gate of the city or the town, the elders would sit, and the elders would be the ones adjudicating cases. So they would know people. So they would be familiar with the people that are being brought to them. And what you have in the ancient world, as you have today, is the reality, and there's laws about this. I just gave you this more general, about bribery, where people will get bribed. And the prophets denounce the bribery in the courts, where the wealthy and the well-to-do and the well-placed would be able to twist the system. And what he's calling for here is, and even the crowd, even going with the way the society is going, he's calling for pure objectivity, and even saying, don't show favoritism to the poor. See? Don't do kind of false sympathy. Do what is right. And those who work with the poor, the poor, are, we can idealize them, but sometimes they're not very good either. I mean, so if we're honest. So what he's saying is, again, systemic, the law courts. So we're seeing the crying out against oppression, even though it's not defined what they do. Here it's the law courts. And this is a central theme throughout the law, and also in the prophets, and also you have stories about this in the history. So the idea of legal righteousness and transparency and honesty. And again, this is very, very systemic. So I've talked about God in the Ten Commandments. I've talked about God's response to the crying out in Exodus 22. And in 23, we're talking law. Now, in Deuteronomy 24, what you have are a series of laws. In this chapter 24 and 19 in Deuteronomy are full of these kinds of things. But in verse 10, listen to how you're supposed to be gentle and wise with those who are unfortunate. He says, when you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, don't go into his house to get what he's offering as a pledge. And so if I was going to borrow some money from Herb, I might give you maybe a cloak or something like this to tell you I'll pay you back. But the idea, the person who's asking for a loan here would be a person in desperate need. And so you can see the idea of not barging into the home and taking it, but giving them the dignity and the time to bring it out to you. Stay outside and let the man to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. If the man is poor, do not go to sleep with his pledge in your possession. Meaning, if Herb gives me his cloak as a pledge, not to use the pledge to keep myself warm, where I'm taking advantage of what you've given me, you see, instead of just kind of holding on to it. Return his cloak to him by sunset, so he can sleep in it, because obviously the cloak would be what he would keep himself warm in. Most people would be sleeping on the floor, dirt floor. Only the rich had beds. Everyone else sleeps on the floor. Maybe have a mat made of straw or something. You can imagine how cold it would be at night. So this is how they would wrap themselves up. Then he will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord our God. So what you're seeing is, even in this time of need of someone needing money, just the compassion to the one in need. Verse 17, do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice. In the Old Testament, I need to say this. When they say orphan, they normally mean the fatherless, not the one without a mother. It'd be the fatherless. And the lack of a man in the household is, for all the reasons I gave you, makes it really particularly precarious for those who are left behind. Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Okay, again, you're seeing the motivation. And the Lord your God redeemed you from there. This is why I command you to do this. You see? When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. So what I'm trying to do in each of these passages is make a different point. Okay, so God, and the God of ethics, if you want to call it that, the Exodus 22, the crying out and how God hears the cry of the vulnerable. Exodus 23, the law courts and the need to be honest and fair. Deuteronomy 24, the motivations for living an ethical life as a community is to remember what had happened to them in the past. And he applies it to being hungry. See? And he applies it, to being poor. And so when you move to the Old Testament, the question is this in the law: why should I have to do this? Well, there's different motivations in the law, and I'm looking at the time. I've got to move quickly. The motivations are, the threat of punishment. Even today we do this in our legal system, but also the idea of historical memory. See, you need to remember. And this is why I'm going to jump ahead here and go back to Deuteronomy 15. Deuteronomy 6:6-9, this passage is the one that you always get when you have seminars on the Christian home or something, right? But the point is this: if I can use a Anglican term, this is just another example of catechesis, where the idea of teaching your children, and telling them the story. And what you find in various feasts, they are feasts to remember. So the idea is to build an historical memory, and this becomes a motivation. And so these rituals are formational, not just celebration, they are formation. And part of the formation is ethical and it's memory. And this is why potentially a liturgical calendar is important. It is to help the people remember. Okay, what are we doing in Lent? Well, there's certain things that we're doing, but we're all supposed to remember certain things about our faith and about moving to the cross and all these kinds of ideas. Part of it is the memory, and the memory will actually make you into a different kind of person, into a different kind of community. Every country in the world does this. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, we have 4th of July, last month, MLK, we have, African American Heritage Month, we have Hispanic Heritage Month, now there's Asian American Heritage Month. The idea is not to forget, you see, and to forget is to lose your soul, basically. And countries will have holidays, they have songs they sing, they have stories they tell, because every country in the world does this, is trying to get you to remember certain things, to be a certain kind of people. This can be twisted. If I can use an example of what's going on in Ukraine, Putin has appealed to Stalingrad and that horrific World War II battle in Stalingrad. And he's comparing the Ukrainian war to Stalingrad and standing up to Nazi tanks. I mean, he's appealing to a story, you see, in its own twisted kind of way. Okay, but this catechesis of the rituals of the Feast of Tabernacles and Passover, all these they're actually very, you act them out kind of thing. You see, you don't watch them, you actually act out. You build a little shelter, and you'll stay in there for a week. You see, you'll eat together and make certain foods for Passover. All of this, you're supposed to be ready to move at a moment's notice. You're remembering, and these rituals are forming you, and that's part of your ethical formation is the memory. In verse 4, he says, there should not be any poor among you. Okay? And then he talks about how they should respond to the poor in terms of redeeming their land and things like this. And then in verse 7, it goes, but if there is a poor man or a poor person among you, you do this. And then it says, give generously to him and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you. So responding to the poor, he says, you shouldn't have any poor, but if you do, be generous. And then he says this line, there will always be poor people in the land. Okay, that's the reality. There shouldn't be, but there will be. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your brothers and toward the poor and needy in your land. There shouldn't be poor people, but there will always be poor people. And because of that, he's put some laws in place in this passage about how to respond, but there will always be poor in spite of the best, and all you can do, there will always be poor people, sadly. But because of that, open your hands. Okay, one last passage, and if you want to jot it down, Deuteronomy 10. To me, this is a key passage for so many things. Deuteronomy chapter 10. And I would go from verse 12 through the end of the chapter, Deuteronomy 10, 12. And let me just put it I'll just summarize it because of our time. But what he will say is that God is God of God and Lord of Lords. He shows no partiality. And then it says this, he takes no bribes. You can't bribe God. In the ancient world, you could. The idea was you have to appease the God, you bribe the God, you make him happy, and he'll do something for you. Or if he's angry, you pay him off. I mean, that would be the ancient world. But he says God doesn't take bribes. He's not partial to anybody. And then he says he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and he loves the alien, the foreigner, giving him food and clothing, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you were foreigners in Egypt. And what you're seeing here is the idea of God loving the vulnerable. Specifically in this passage, loving the foreigner. I'm sorry, I got a tickle in my throat, which is frustrating. But when people ask me, why should I love the immigrants? I say, because God does. I can't give you a better answer than that. That's why this passage is so crucial. And what he'll do is he reminds them to go back to Egypt. But he folds in again the fatherless and the widow. You see, so again, the importance of memory, but ultimately the care of the poor, the care of the widow, the care of the orphan, the care of the foreigner are grounded in the heart of God himself. And he has created a people to take care of the vulnerable, along with everything else in their society. And this society, Deuteronomy 4, is supposed to be a beacon and a light to the world.
And he only says to love the sojourner who's like a productive member of society, right?
No.
Just checking.
Yeah.
Productive.
Yeah, that must be in your translation. Yeah, no, yeah, and it's kind of like in any time in history, even again, Ukrainian war or people coming across the border or potato famine, Irish in the 19th century, the people who move are people who are widows and orphans, the children, the women fleeing the war in Ukraine, the men staying behind. They have their suitcases. That's all they have. They've lost everything. And so this is in the ancient world, it would have been the same. The people who actually get to Israel would be poor. And so that's probably why they're grouped together. They're a special kind of poor because they're not Israelites, but they would be, how many of them are widows and orphans? We don't know. But I would suspect that would be a certain percentage of them too.